It began quietly, with a figure on my payslip that didn't belong there. It wasn't speculation or jealousy. It was arithmetic. I had completed 12-hour shifts for 3 consecutive months, covering late deployments, resolving issues others walked away from, and ensuring deadlines were met. Each overtime entry was approved through the company's internal system. My manager even sent congratulatory messages for my dedication. Yet, when payday arrived, the numbers mocked my effort. The extra hours were missing, as if they had never existed. I didn't panic. I printed out every approval, saved the messages, and pulled security logs showing my entry and exit times. I knew better than to confront anyone without evidence. People in their late 30s don't waste energy on shouting matches. We gather facts, and facts don't blink under pressure. Once everything was compiled, I drafted a respectful email to HR, attaching my documentation. I reread it twice, no emotion, no accusations, just clarity. I pressed send. Their response arrived 12 minutes later. No explanation, no request for time, no acknowledgement of data. Just 4 words, separated by a cold full stop. Not a priority right now. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, not because I was surprised, but because of what those words revealed. They weren't denying the claim. They were denying my importance. In that moment, something aligned in me like a switch shifting position. They had underestimated the wrong person. That email wasn't an answer, it was proof. Proof of negligence. Proof of dismissal. Proof that they believed I would accept less than my worth. What they failed to realize was that I wasn't chasing money anymore. I was pursuing accountability. At that moment, I stopped being their employee. I became their consequence. The first time HR invited me to discuss my claim, I walked in expecting clarification. Instead, I was welcomed by a maze disguised as procedure. They asked for proof I had already submitted, then requested forms no one had heard of, and finally insisted I book follow-up meetings during peak working hours, guaranteeing productivity loss that would later be used against me. Nothing was accidental. Every step was designed to drain energy, not resolve issues. I watched colleagues abandon their claims halfway through, not because they were wrong, but because exhaustion defeated them. The tone of the meetings never changed. HR representatives smiled, nodded, and rehearsed empathy without delivering a single measurable result. Every session ended exactly the same way, 3 meaningless words spoken with the calm of someone who believed they were untouchable. "We'll get back to you." They never did. Not once. Their silence was not negligence, it was strategy. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. I wasn't chasing a conversation. I was assembling a case. I printed every email they sent, every meeting summary, every contradictory instruction. I tracked the length of each delay, the number of times they claimed to be waiting for internal validation, and the total amount of unpaid hours sitting in their pockets. I discovered that I wasn't the first victim. 5 names appeared during my search, employees who had once complained, then disappeared without resolution. The system didn't need to deny claims. It simply waited for people to surrender. What HR failed to grasp was simple. I don't surrender. Each delay strengthened my file. Each request they ignored became evidence. I wasn't dealing with incompetence. I was dealing with a machine built to exhaust resistance. Machines don't scare me. Timelines destroy them. It began with a glance. One of those cautious looks people exchange when they sense trouble brewing but aren't sure if they should get involved. A colleague approached me near the coffee machine and asked if I had ever received my overtime. His tone was casual, but his eyes told a different story. Moments later, another coworker leaned in and confessed she hadn't been paid for her unused holiday days in over a year. She had complained twice. Both times, HR claimed her request was being processed. The whispers grew louder. In the corner of the break room, someone revealed his bonus had been under review for 8 months, despite outperforming targets. Another employee admitted she had stopped asking because every inquiry led to more paperwork and no results. They weren't discussing inconvenience. They were describing a pattern. Contracts appeared from desk drawers. Screenshots of ignored emails surfaced. People who had never spoken to each other suddenly shared identical experiences. The common thread was unmistakable. Every delayed payment benefited the same department, while every complainant left frustrated and tired. HR didn't deny the claims. They simply stalled them until employees gave up. What startled me wasn't the number of victims. It was the realization that no one connected the dots before. We had each assumed our situation was isolated, a clerical hiccup, a rare oversight. But I could now see it clearly. This wasn't negligence. It was strategy. The company didn't save money through innovation or efficiency. It profited through silence. The missing wages weren't mistakes, they were revenue. I wasn't fighting a department. I was fighting a business model built on delay and resignation. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were testimonies. And testimonies, when aligned, become evidence. I wasn't alone anymore. I was leading a quiet uprising. The invitation arrived as a calendar alert. No context, no agenda, just a time and a room. Most employees would have walked in nervous. I walked in prepared. The boardroom was colder than usual, the type of temperature companies use to tilt the psychological balance. 3 managers sat clustered at one end of the table, a lawyer positioned like a silent threat, and an HR representative wearing the strained smile of someone pretending to be in control. They expected me to apologize for creating disruption. They expected compliance, perhaps a nervous explanation about misunderstanding procedures. Instead, I slid a heavy black binder across the polished table. It landed with a dull thud that shifted the atmosphere. This wasn't emotion. This was evidence. The lawyer opened it casually, expecting a few disgruntled notes. He froze after the first page. Inside was a meticulously structured timeline. Labor codes with highlighted clauses, time-stamped approvals of my overtime, state-mandated deadlines they had missed, screenshots of ignored inquiries, and the most damaging section, signed testimonies from 7 employees who had experienced the same pattern of withheld payments. The room changed instantly. Managers exchanged glances, the HR rep's smile dissolved, and the lawyer adjusted his tie, not out of comfort, but out of panic. No one spoke. They didn't ask questions because every potential question was already answered in that binder. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I didn't need to. Silence became the verdict they couldn't escape. Each page I turned was another strike they couldn't refute. By the time I finished, no one dared mention miscommunication or administrative delay. They realized something dangerous. My complaint was no longer internal. It was legal. That meeting wasn't their intervention. It was my declaration of war. For weeks, HR treated my emails like background noise, something to be postponed, rerouted, or buried under procedural jargon. They assumed time was on their side. What they didn't realize was that time wasn't neutral. In employment law, it's a weapon, and every day they ignored me was another inch of rope they wrapped around their own neck. On day 61, I contacted a labor rights organization. They confirmed what my binder had already revealed. The company had legally 3 specific obligations: acknowledge the claim, investigate it, and respond within 60 days. They did none of the 3. On day 63, the law didn't just see my issue as a complaint anymore, it recognized it as a violation. That single missed deadline transformed HR's indifference into actionable misconduct. The shift was immediate. My inbox, once a graveyard of automated replies, suddenly exploded. The same HR manager who dismissed my email without a greeting now addressed me by full name, copied supervisors on every message, and inserted terms like priority assessment, internal urgency, and expedited resolution. Their tone had changed, but the damage was already done. Because now my documentation wasn't a personal file, it was admissible evidence. Every ignored message became proof of negligence. Every delay was a breach. Every testimony from my colleagues strengthened the case for systemic abuse. The company wasn't facing a paycheck correction anymore. They were staring down fines, regulatory audits, and the possibility of a class action lawsuit that could wipe out an entire quarter's profit. My unpaid wages were no longer a financial oversight. They were the trigger that exposed a corporate mechanism built on silence and intimidation. The legal clock they assumed I didn't understand was now ticking loudly, and it wasn't counting down for me. It was counting down for them. On a Tuesday morning, just before lunch, the reception desk called every manager on the internal line. Their voices trembled as they repeated the same phrase. "There's someone here from the Labor Ministry." No warning. No polite email. No scheduled appointment. The inspector stepped into the building with a folder so thick it looked like a verdict waiting to land. He didn't smile. He didn't greet anyone. He simply displayed his badge and asked for a room. Not a meeting room, a records room. He requested payroll logs, overtime approvals, bank transfer reports, and all employee contracts from the past 3 years. The managers who once dismissed my concerns with humor suddenly couldn't maintain eye contact. Their confidence wasn't just gone, it had evaporated. HR attempted to stall, claiming certain documents were in transition, but the inspector wasn't interested in excuses. He gave them 30 minutes. Nothing more. By the afternoon, the atmosphere in the office had shifted completely. Employees whispered as files were hauled out like contraband. Screens that once displayed motivational quotes now flickered with spreadsheets, redacted bonuses, and missing payment trails. The inspector cross-referenced signatures, timestamps, and approvals. Every small inconsistency he found was recorded, not casually, but with the precision of someone who already suspected criminal intent. The results were catastrophic. Overtime discrepancies weren't minor. They were systematic. Unpaid bonuses weren't pending. They were hidden. Deductions weren't accidental. They were illegal. Everything HR labeled as a system limitation was now documented as willful wage theft, a legal term that changes the tone of every conversation. By the end of the day, it was no longer about me. The investigation expanded to departments I'd never worked in. What began as missing overtime had detonated into a corporate scandal. They hadn't ignored an employee. They had awakened an audit. The transfer notification arrived before sunrise. No apology. No explanation. Just a number so precise it revealed panic, not generosity. They hadn't merely paid what they owed. They added damages, statutory penalties, late fees, and interest calculated down to the minute. The company that once treated my emails like clutter suddenly moved with the urgency of a business fighting extinction. Money had never flowed that fast before. An hour later, HR requested a meeting. The tone was different this time. No corporate smiles, no patronizing reassurance. They slid a stack of documents across the table. At the top, highlighted in yellow, were the words they hoped would bury everything: non-disclosure agreement. The pages promised benefits if I agreed never to speak about the missing wages, the ignored deadlines, the audit, or the inspector who changed the destiny of the company. They wanted silence because silence is cheaper than reform. I read every sentence, without emotion. They spoke of misunderstandings, procedural misalignment, and unintentional oversights, all phrases engineered to avoid admitting the truth. I pushed the papers back untouched. My voice didn't rise. My pulse didn't change. I said only one sentence: "You can refund wages, but you can't buy dignity." Their faces fell. They weren't negotiating with an upset employee anymore. They were confronting documentation they couldn't erase, dates they couldn't bend, and a precedent they couldn't afford to repeat. My refusal wasn't rebellion, it was evidence that couldn't be contained by a signature. Leaving the room, I printed the bank transaction and filed it alongside my binder. That payment wasn't a resolution. It was an admission, signed in numbers rather than ink. They wanted to close the chapter quietly. I ensured it had a title. They paid what they owed. I kept the proof they feared. The story didn't end with a bank transfer. It began with one. After the audit, after the settlement, after the failed attempt to buy my silence, something unexpected happened. People started calling. First, it was a former colleague asking how I managed to push my claim through. Then another. Soon, it wasn't individuals, it was entire teams, union representatives, and eventually companies wanting training to prevent the very problem they once ignored. I didn't plan a new career. It formed itself. I created a seminar titled The Invisible Paycheck: Detecting Wage Theft Before It Happens. The first session had 12 attendees. The next had 40. Today, rooms fill to capacity weeks in advance. And the most ironic twist? HR departments, the same type of professionals who once dismissed my emails, now purchase seats for their staff. They sit quietly, avoid eye contact, and take notes as I dissect the strategies they use to exhaust employees into silence. Companies contact me before launching new payroll systems, asking for guidance on compliance. Executives request audits, not because they're honest, but because they fear headlines. My invoices are no longer follow-ups, they're prerequisites. No one dares postpone my communications. No one replies with forward emails. People assume revenge is emotional, a storm, a confrontation, a dramatic outburst. It isn't. Revenge is arithmetic, time plus evidence plus consequences. HR told me my claim wasn't a priority. They were absolutely right. It wasn't. Not until ignoring it became more expensive than fixing it. I didn't burn bridges. I built a lane no one expected me to own. One where silence costs more than truth, and where companies now pay to learn the lesson they once tried to bury. Revenge isn't noise. Revenge is math. And math never forgets.